Today, I want to talk to you about a very important topic. I want to talk to you about how to deal with challenging situations. And more importantly, I want to talk to you about what not to do when faced with a situation like that. Keep listening to learn more. Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Growth Philosophy Podcast, a bite-sized weekly podcast focused on empowering you to think better and upgrade your life. So let's talk about challenging situations and how to deal with them, as well as what not to do if and when you're faced with one. But before we begin, let me ask you something. What is your usual reaction when faced with a stressful or challenging situation? Do you handle it and get in front of the situation right away? Or do you try to delay dealing with the matter for as long as possible? Whichever of those two options you generally go for, the usual option that most people opt for is unfortunately the second one. Most people try to avoid dealing with the challenging situation as long as possible. How do I know this? Well, I've seen this happen over and over, and I've even done this myself in the past. So I have some first-hand experience of this, and I know how easy it is to get into that mindset, to fall into that trap, and to try and avoid dealing with an unpleasant or challenging situation for as long as possible. After all, no one really likes adding stress to their lives, and facing a challenging situation head-on is pretty much always stressful. It's never pleasant dealing with a challenging situation. If dealing with them was a breeze and made us happy, they would not be challenging situations. I understand why avoiding dealing with a challenging situation is the default for most people. I totally understand it. Here's the thing though. Even though in the short term, avoidance can or might help you feel good and stops extra stress being added to your life, it isn't a viable option in the long term. In fact, the nature of challenging situations is such that the longer you delay dealing with them, the worse they tend to get. Think of a challenging situation like a small fire in an apartment or a house. If it's handled right away or early enough, the damage would be minimal, if not trivial. But if left to its own devices, that small fire, that tiny little fire, will grow and grow until it becomes a big one that can engulf anything and everything in its path and can burn down the whole place. Have you ever heard about or seen a forest fire and how they can burn down massive forests? Those fires don't start their lives as massive ones. They don't just appear as huge fires. They all start their lives as small, tiny fires. In fact, they all start their lives as really insignificant little fires, which then keep growing and growing until they become monstrous and catastrophic fires. Like the big one in Australia last year that burned down 16 acres of land and affected over 3 billion animals. Not million, 3 billion animals. Not to mention the thousands of human lives it impacted negatively. It burned down houses and did an immense amount of damage. It was all over the news, so I would be very surprised if you did not hear about it. So even catastrophic forest fires like the 2020 Australian wildfire start small. They don't just appear out of nowhere and become huge fires. They start small. And it works in pretty much the same way with challenging situations in your life as well. They start small and then they grow over time. Clearly then, trying to avoid dealing with a problem does not help. As often, if not always, it actually makes matters worse. This alone is reason enough to not avoid dealing with issues, no matter how stressful they might seem right away. But that's not all. There is more reason behind this. more reason for why you should not avoid dealing with situations. So here is another big one. Another big reason why trying to avoid dealing with issues or burying your head in the sand is bad for you is the nagging stress it causes. Now, you might think that not dealing with the issue helps you not have any extra stress, but the reality is that the stress or anxiety doesn't completely go away. It might not be obvious or in your face, but it doesn't just go away. It's there. It's there under the surface, just causing you that nagging discomfort and anxiety. For some, it might even cause sleepless nights. As such, the goal of avoiding stress by avoiding dealing with the issue isn't entirely a successful one. Because the stress and anxiety don't go away completely, and often things get more and more stressful as time passes and things start to escalate and get worse. Hardly sounds ideal or ultimately worth it, right? So the whole idea of avoiding stress doesn't actually work out. So that's yet another reason why avoiding issues is not ultimately good for you. But there is more. Do you want to know the biggest reason why burying your head in the sand or trying to avoid or disregard a problem is ultimately a bad idea? The biggest reason. It's because you can't run away from the issue forever. It's just not possible. The issue or the problem will catch up to you. It always does. It's unavoidable. And it always happens. The only difference is that when you act on the issue and get in front of it early on, you have a fighting chance of coming up on top. When you get ahead of the problem, you have an opportunity to deal with the matter and even fix the matter. On the other hand, when you try to avoid or ignore a problem, it might not result into anything right away, but when it does catch up to you eventually, the negative impact will be far worse than if you had dealt with it early on. A prime example of this are financial penalties like late bills and so on. The more you ignore or delay dealing with issues like that, the worse the situation gets. I can't even begin to tell you the number of people I dealt with who nearly lost everything they had because they kept ignoring and hiding away from their problems. Running away does not fix anything. It only makes things worse. This is why dealing with issues like a late fee notice as soon as possible is much, much better than just ignoring it and then getting penalized for it. Delaying does not help. You might think it does, but it doesn't. But it does usually cause the problem to get worse. And in a scenario like late fees or penalties, you can end up having to pay a lot more and maybe even get taken to court for it. It's just not worth it. The momentary short-term respite that comes from avoiding dealing with an issue is hardly ever worth the bigger problem it becomes down the line. So here is the bottom line. Running from reality does not work. It might work for a while, but reality will catch up at some point or the other. It always does. And then when it does, the impact is nearly always a lot worse than it would have been if you had dealt with the issue early on, in the beginning. A stitch in time does save 9. I came across this really great quote the other day about how fear flourishes in the darkness, and how when you shed light on the fear, they start losing their hold over you. And I thought that really made a lot of sense. The impact of anything you fear, after all, loses its potency when you actually start facing it. This is why exposure is one of the most effective ways of dealing with phobias, and it works on pretty much anything you fear in life. Challenges rarely go away when you try to run away from them, but they do tend to get better when you put yourself back in the driving seat and decide to deal with them. Whenever you're faced with a problem, you basically have two options. You can either get in the driving seat and deal with the matter, or you can let the problem take charge and then be forced to deal with the consequences. So you can either deal with the matter or you can deal with the consequences. The first option gives you at least some opportunity to deal with things on your own terms, while opting to do nothing and burying your head in the sand leaves you with little to no control on how things pan out. It should be pretty obvious by now which option is the better one. Don't ignore your problems, because that nearly always makes things worse. If you want a guaranteed way to make things worse, well, that's really the option to go for. Ignore your problems. But if you do not want things to get worse, then you cannot avoid them. So a far better strategy is to deal with them as soon as possible. Remember, the longer you take to deal with an issue, the worse things usually get. So take charge of your own life, no matter how unpleasant it sometimes gets. And I know it gets unpleasant sometimes. Life is not easy. Not always. So take charge, even if it seems unpleasant sometimes. Take charge and deal with problems head on, not just because it is the smart thing to do, but also because that is the best way to minimize any negative impact it can have on your life. Take charge, ultimately, because that is how you will lead a better life. So do it. Stop trying to avoid problems and run away from problems. That does not help. Do the opposite instead, because your life will be far better if you face the problem and work on dealing with it. I sincerely hope that you found this talk useful and that you at least took one thing away from this that can help you improve your life. If you have any questions or suggestions, or even ideas for future topics, feel free to send them to me. The links are in the description. And if you enjoyed this talk, please remember to like, subscribe, and share with others who might also find this useful. I look forward to having you all listen in again next week. Same place, same time. Until then, remember to take care of yourself and try not to avoid problems. Alright everyone, have a great week.